The council hall smelled of burning resin, melted candle wax, and the heavy red wine that filled the iron goblets of every lord seated along the carved oak table. Maisie stood near the far column, her hands folded in front of her linen apron, and watched the king walk in. It was impossible not to watch Adrian when he entered a room. He moved through the arched stone doorway with that slow, deliberate pace that seemed calculated but wasn't. She had learned that much in 3 years of serving inside Arden's walls. It was simply the way of a man who had never needed to prove his authority to anyone, because the very air around him already understood it should step aside. His dark braids fell over the fur-lined shoulders of his black manto, and his eyes, that particular shade of deep blue that looked carved from the same stone as the castle walls, swept the room without hurry, without urgency, the way a predator surveys land it already owns. Maisie should not have been there. Technically, no untitled Omega had a place at the Council of Pax, that annual gathering where the lords and ladies of every allied clan presented their daughters, their disputes, and their alliances to the Alpha King of Arden. Maisie was there because Nora, the head cook, the stout woman with flour-dusted forearms who was the closest thing to family Maisie had known since her 22nd year, had needed help carrying the trays of herb bread and bone broth that would be served before the formal feast. Servant's work. The only kind of work available to an Omega without noble blood. She was there to serve bread, and yet, when Adrian's gaze crossed the length of the hall and landed on her for the space of a single breath, Maisie felt something tighten in her chest, like a knot she hadn't known existed being pulled at from both ends. She looked away immediately. Never looked directly at the king. Nora's voice lived somewhere behind her sternum, clear as a struck bell. The woman had repeated it so many times that Maisie could almost hear the snap of thick fingers alongside the words. Omegas did not hold the gaze of alphas. Untitled Omegas did not hold the gaze of any alpha, let alone the king. But Adrian had looked at her first. The hall filled steadily with imposing figures. Pack lords in mantles embroidered with their clan crests. The black raven of Velmore, the silver stag of Ashen, the twin wolves of Draven. The women beside them wore heavy jewelry and expressions heavier still. Maisie recognized Lady Corrine, daughter of Velmore's lord, with her black hair pinned in an elaborate arrangement and a deep green gown that cost more than Maisie would earn in 5 years of service. Corrine glanced at her the way one glances at a stone in the road, not really seeing it, only registering that it exists and should be stepped around. Maisie carried her tray to the long oak table and set it carefully between 2 iron candelabras. Her movements were quiet. She had learned that early. The less space you occupied, the fewer targets you offered. That was when she heard the voice. "You're spilling oil on the cloth. Low. Direct." No elevation of tone, no reproach, simply a factual observation delivered by someone who never needed to repeat himself. Maisie looked down. The small flask of herb oil she carried in her other hand had tilted, and a thin golden thread was running down onto the white linen tablecloth. She righted it on instinct, caught the corner of her apron, and pressed the stain with quick, practiced movements. When she looked up, Adrian was 2 steps away. Up close, he was even harder to ignore. The scar that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down to his jaw was sharper under torchlight. The dark leather of his armor showed real wear. Not the decorative kind the lords favored to appear like warriors, but the small cuts and compressed folds that only came from genuine combat. He smelled like forest after rain, and something darker underneath it. Something Maisie couldn't name, but that made the most instinctive part of her want simultaneously to step back and to go completely, absolutely still. She went still. "Forgive me, my king," she said, and inclined her head at the correct angle. Not too deep, just enough. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He stood looking at her with that expression that wasn't quite an expression, simply concentrated presence, as though reading something written in very small letters. "Are you from the household?" he asked. "From the kitchens, my king." "Your name?" There was something odd about the question. Lords didn't ask servants for their names. Kings asked even less. "Maisie," she answered. He repeated the name in silence. She saw his lips move, just slightly, and then, without another word, moved toward the center of the hall where Lord Councillor Irvin was already waiting with a face flushed red with anxiety. Maisie released the breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. "Maisie." The voice came from beside her, low and urgent, and she recognized it without looking. Senna appeared the way she always appeared. Suddenly, with her brown hair half escaped from its braid, and her eyes wide with that expression that blended alarm and fascination in equal parts. Senna was a laundress, 2 years older than Maisie, and had been the first person to show her where the extra blankets were kept during Maisie's first winter at Arden's castle, when she had arrived at 22 with nowhere else to go, and nothing to her name but a worn gray cloak and the ability to work without complaint. "The king just asked your name," Senna whispered, gripping Maisie's arm. "I know. He never asks anyone's name." "I know, Senna." "You've gone pale." "I'm aware of that too." Senna released her arm, but didn't stop staring with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they cannot classify. Maisie picked up her tray and continued moving along the table, quiet and efficient as always. But something had shifted in the air around her in that hall, and she could not decide whether it was real or imagined. 3 weeks later, she was summoned. Not by the counselor, not by the Lady of Chambers, by the king's own personal messenger, a young wolf with Arden's crest on his chest, the solitary wolf on a field of black, who appeared at the kitchen entrance and spoke her name like a verdict. Nora went white. Senna dropped the bowl of flour she was holding. Maisie washed her hands in the basin, dried them on her apron, and followed the messenger. The corridor leading to the king's private study was different from the rest of the castle. The stones were darker, older, and the torches on the walls burned with a lower and steadier flame, without the trembling that wine caused in the open passageways. Heavy tapestries lined the floor, rare in a castle where most stone remained bare to the cold, and the crests on the walls bore no visiting lord's emblem, only Arden's solitary wolf, repeated at regular intervals like a quiet reminder of exactly where you stood. The messenger stopped before a dark wooden door reinforced with iron and knocked twice. "Come in," said the voice on the other side. Maisie entered. Adrian stood at the narrow window overlooking the castle's inner courtyard, hands clasped behind his back, gaze directed outward. He wasn't in full armor, only dark leather over a shirt with sleeves rolled to the forearm, his braids slightly looser than before. He looked marginally more human like this. Only marginally. He turned when she entered, and Maisie kept her eyes at the correct point, a neutral spot somewhere between his chin and the center of his chest. Omega posture before an alpha. She knew it by memory. "You can look at me," he said. She raised her eyes. "I have a task for you," Adrian said, and there was something different in his tone. Not a command, not quite a request. The tone of someone about to say something that matters, and choosing each word with care. Outside the castle walls, in Cinderfield. Maisie knew the name. Everyone inside Arden's walls knew Cinderfield. It was the village at the edge of the kingdom's poorest territory, a cluster of low stone houses with crumbling roofs, barely surviving each winter on what little the rocky soil could offer. People there did not have enough. They rarely had close to enough. "What would you have me do there, my king?" she asked. Adrian studied her for a long moment before he answered. "Live there," he said simply. "For 2 weeks. As one of them." The silence that followed was complete. The silence stretched long enough that Maisie heard the distant clang of iron from the training yard below the window and the low creak of the castle settling into the cold of the evening. Live there. As one of them. She turned the words over carefully, the way she might turn a stone found in an unfamiliar river, examining it before deciding whether to trust the ground beneath. "For 2 weeks," she repeated, not as a question, but as confirmation, making sure she had understood correctly. Yes. Alone? You will have an escort to the edge of the territory. After that, Adrian paused, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a small tightening around the jaw. You go in as yourself. No castle title. No connection to Arden's household. You are simply a woman passing through who needs shelter. Maisie absorbed this. She clasped her hands in front of her. The old habit, the gesture that helped her think without showing that she was thinking. May I ask why, my king? Most lords would have dismissed the question. Most alphas would have raised an eyebrow at the audacity of a kitchen omega asking for the reason behind a royal instruction. Adrian did neither. He turned from the window fully and looked at her with that same quality of attention he'd given her in the council hall, that reading something in small letters focus, and seemed to weigh whether her question deserved an honest answer. He apparently decided it did. Cinderfield is failing, he said, moving toward the large stone desk covered in maps and sealed correspondence. 3 winters of poor harvest. A sickness that went through the livestock last autumn. The village elder sent word that they are short on stores before the next frost. I have sent coin twice. Both times the reports that came back told me the coin reached them and helped. He stopped at the desk and turned to face her. But I want to know what is actually happening there, what the coin did not fix, what the reports did not say. Maisie looked at him carefully. And you are sending me because a king's official arrives in a village and everyone performs. They show him what they want him to see. A pause. A woman traveling alone, with no crest and no title, sees what is actually there. It was logical, clean, the kind of thinking that explained, perhaps, why Arden had remained stable while 3 neighboring kingdoms had fractured in the last decade. Maisie understood the reasoning perfectly. What she did not yet understand was why her specifically. She was a kitchen servant. There were stewards trained for exactly this kind of inquiry, men and women who had spent years learning how to read territories and report accurately to the crown. She was no one. She had no training in diplomacy, no background in territory assessment, no experience beyond the castle kitchens and the small village she had grown up in before it burned, before she had nothing, before she had walked 3 days to reach Arden's gates and asked for any work available. My king, she said, keeping her voice level, there are people in your service far better suited to this than I am. I know, he said. Then why? Because I watched you in the council hall, Adrian said. And his voice was quieter now. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. Each word placed with intention. You moved through a room full of lords and alphas and highborn women, and you did not perform. You did not shrink, and you did not pretend. You spilled oil on the cloth and you corrected it without panic and without making it into more than it was. He held her gaze. I need someone who sees things as they are, not as they should be reported. The torchlight moved on the stone walls. Somewhere far below in the kitchens, Maisie could faintly hear the clatter of pots that meant Nora was beginning the evening clear-up, the familiar rhythm of the only life she had known for 3 years. She thought of Cinderfield, of low stone houses and crumbling roofs and people who had not had enough for 3 winters running. She thought of what that actually meant in the body, the specific weight of cold that settles into joints when there is not enough food to keep warmth in the blood, the way hunger makes everything quieter, the way people stop laughing first and stop hoping second. She knew those things, not from reports, from memory. I will go, she said. Adrian held her gaze for one more moment, then gave a single nod. He reached into the interior of his leather armor and withdrew a small folded square of cloth, which he placed on the edge of the desk between them. She stepped forward and picked it up. Inside was a modest amount of coin, enough for a traveler, not enough to seem wealthy, and a strip of undyed linen with nothing written on it. The blank cloth, she said. If something is wrong and you need to return, tie it to the eastern gate post at the edge of the village. My men watch the road. And if nothing is wrong? Then you come back in 14 days and you tell me what you found. Maisie folded the cloth carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She inclined her head. I'll need to tell Nora, she said. She'll worry. Something crossed Adrian's face then. Not a smile, not quite, but a small shift at the corner of his mouth that looked like it might have been a smile's quieter, less committed cousin. I already told her, he said. Maisie looked at him. She didn't seem to know when I left the kitchen. She knew. She simply preferred the dramatic reaction. Maisie thought of the dropped flower bowl and reconsidered. That was, in fact, entirely consistent with Senna rather than Nora. Nora's reaction had been silence, she realized, and stillness, which for the head cook was the loudest response possible. She almost smiled. She didn't. When do I leave? She asked. Dawn. She nodded once more, turned, and moved toward the door. She had her hand on the iron handle when his voice reached her again. Maisie. She stopped. Take the gray cloak, he said. Not the castle-issued one. The one you came with. She turned slightly. He was already looking back at the maps on his desk, one hand braced against the stone surface, the other tracing a line on the parchment with his finger. She left without asking how he knew about the cloak. Senna was waiting for her outside the kitchen entrance, sitting on the low stone wall with her knees pulled up and her expression oscillating rapidly between worry and barely contained interrogation. The moment Maisie appeared around the corner, Senna unfolded herself from the wall and closed the distance in 4 steps. Well? She demanded. I'm leaving at dawn, Maisie said. Leaving, Senna repeated, her voice pitching upward in a way that made a passing stable boy glance over. She lowered it immediately. Leaving where? For how long? Did he... 2 weeks. Cinderfield. Senna stared. That's the poorest village in the Eastern Territory. I know. He's sending you alone to the poorest village in the Eastern Territory. Yes. Why? Maisie looked at her friend for a moment. At the worried crease between her brows. At the way Senna's hands had found the front of her apron and were gripping it in the unconscious gesture she made whenever she was trying not to say 6 things at once. Because he thinks I'll see what's actually there, Maisie said. Senna was quiet for a moment. Then, and what do you think? Maisie considered that honestly. She turned the question the same way she'd turned the king's words earlier, slowly, looking at all sides. What did she think? She thought that the request was strange. She thought that a king who could send trained stewards and seasoned scouts had instead summoned a kitchen omega and looked at her with the specific focused attention of someone searching for something real. She thought that Cinderfield's failing winters were the stated reason, and probably also the true reason. But that somewhere underneath the pragmatic logic of the thing, something else was operating. Something she didn't have enough information yet to name. She thought about the way he'd said, I watched you in the council hall, with the same matter-of-fact directness he seemed to apply to everything, as though observation was simply a neutral act, and not one that carried any weight. I think, she said finally, that I should pack light. Senna exhaled through her nose, which was as close as she came to laughing when she was worried. She pulled Maisie into a brief, fierce embrace, the kind that said, come back without using the words, and then released her and stepped back. I'll get your cloak, she said. The gray one. Maisie nodded and looked out past the kitchen garden wall toward the dark line of the forest that circled Arden's outer territory, where the road east began. Somewhere beyond that tree line, 2 weeks away, and 1 kingdom poorer, a village was waiting. She didn't know yet what she would find there. She didn't know yet that Adrian, standing at his study window watching the courtyard below, already knew exactly what she would do. and was watching not to confirm a suspicion about Cinderfield, but to confirm something far more important about her. Something he had been watching, quietly and without announcement, for a very long time. The road to Cinderfield was 3 hours on horseback, and a different world entirely. Maisie felt the change before she saw it. The air shifted first, losing the smoke and iron smell of the castle, picking up wet earth and pine resin and something underneath both of those, something thin and cold that she recognized from her own childhood as the particular scent of a place where people were stretched to their limits and holding still so as not to break. The escort Adrian had assigned, 2 quiet wolves who rode on either side of her without speaking, stopped at a low stone marker half buried in mud at the edge of a tree line, and the older of the 2 nodded once at the path ahead. "Cinderfield is a half-mile on," he said. "We'll be on the road." She nodded, adjusted the gray cloak around her shoulders, and rode forward alone. The village appeared gradually, the way struggling places tended to, not announcing itself, but simply becoming visible in stages, one detail at a time. A fence with 3 posts missing. A well with a cracked stone lip. A row of low houses built from the same dark stone as the land around them, their thatched roofs patched in uneven layers that told the story of several bad seasons repaired with whatever material had been available at the time. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys out of the 7 she could count. 2. Maisie slowed her horse to a walk and let herself simply look. A woman was hauling water from the well, her arms moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed this task so many times it no longer required thought. She was perhaps 40, but carried herself like someone older, the particular posture of sustained physical work and sustained worry combined. She noticed Maisie and stopped, one hand still on the rope, and looked at her with the cautious assessment that all isolated communities turned on strangers. "Traveling?" the woman asked. Not unfriendly, careful. "Looking for somewhere to shelter a few days, if anyone can spare a corner," Maisie said. The woman studied her for a moment. The worn cloak, the modest horse, the absence of any crest or sigil. Whatever she saw, it apparently satisfied her basic threat assessment. "Etta might," she said, nodding toward the second house from the end. "She's got the room since her son left for the southern packs. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. It's cold." It was, Maisie discovered, an understatement. Etta was a small, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 60, with white hair cropped close to her head and the kind of stillness that came from decades of making decisions alone. She looked Maisie over with the same careful assessment as the woman at the well, asked 2 direct questions: where from, how long, and when Maisie answered honestly on both counts, stepped back from the doorway and said simply, "Fireplace is through there. Wood's low. If you want to stay, you work." "That's fair," Maisie said. She tied her horse at the post, took her small pack inside, and looked around at what would be her home for the next 14 days. The house had 2 rooms. The main room held the fireplace, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf with a handful of clay pots, and a small iron hook on the wall, where a bunch of dried herbs hung, brown and brittle, and clearly the last of a supply that hadn't been replenished. The second room had a narrow bed with a wool blanket that had been mended so many times. The original weave was barely visible beneath the patches. The floor was stone. The window was covered with a piece of oiled cloth rather than glass, and the cold came through the edges of it in a thin, persistent current that no amount of careful positioning could entirely escape. Maisie set her pack down, rolled up her sleeves, and started working. What she found in Cinderfield over the following days was not dramatic. There was no single disaster, no visible catastrophe she could point to and report. What there was instead was the accumulated weight of small failures across every system that kept a community alive. The kind of damage that doesn't show in official reports because no single part of it crosses the threshold of emergency, but that in combination creates a situation where people are quietly, steadily losing ground. The coin Adrian had sent had helped. She could see that. The well had been repaired. The road at the village's northern edge had been cleared of the fallen tree that had blocked supply cart access the previous winter. Those were real improvements. But coin alone couldn't fix what was actually wrong, which was that Cinderfield had lost too many of its working-age wolves in the past 2 years. 3 young men had left for the southern packs where work was more available. One had died in a border skirmish. The blacksmith's wife, who had also been the village's primary herbalist, had died of fever the previous spring. That last absence Maisie felt everywhere. There was a child, a girl of perhaps 7, who had been running a fever for 4 days. Her mother, a young Omega named Bretta with shadows under her eyes deep enough to look like bruises, had been managing it with cold compresses and prayer, which was all she had available, because the nearest healer was 2 villages over, and Bretta had no horse and no coin to spare for the journey. Maisie knew fevers. She had grown up in a village not unlike this one, and before it had burned, her mother had been precisely the kind of woman who knew what grew along creek beds, and what could be coaxed out of a kitchen garden in early frost, and what combination of things could bring a fever down without a healer's trained hand. She went to the creek on the second morning. The cold bit at her fingers as she crouched at the water's edge, turning over stones and examining the growth along the muddy bank with the focused attention of someone reconstructing a memory. Feverfew, still alive under the frost line. Wild ginger root, thin but viable. The gray-green leaves of a plant her mother had called silver ear, pressed flat against a rock just above the water line, which most people walked past without recognizing. She gathered what she found, returned to Etta's house, and spent the afternoon at the fireplace. Etta watched her from the second chair with her arms folded and said nothing for a long time. Then, "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother," Maisie said, not looking up from the clay pot. "She a healer?" "She knew things," Maisie said simply. "The kind of things that don't have a title." Etta was quiet again. Then, "The child's been worse since yesterday." "I know. I'll bring this to Bretta when it's ready." Another silence. Then, in a tone that was not quite gratitude but was the closest thing to it that a woman like Etta seemed comfortable offering, "You're not just passing through, are you?" It wasn't a question. "No," Maisie said. "I'm not." By the 5th day, she had established a rhythm that felt less like an assignment, and more like something she recognized from a part of herself she had set aside when she arrived at Arden's castle walls. She woke before dawn, helped Etta with the morning fire in the water hall, and then moved through the village doing the specific, unglamorous, necessary work that no official report ever captured. She sat with Bretta's daughter while the fever broke, keeping cool compresses on her forehead through the night and telling quiet stories in the dark when the child was restless. She helped the old man at the end of the row, Colin, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite the previous winter, repair the gap in his roof before the next rain came. She organized 3 of the remaining village women into a rotation for firewood collection that halved the individual effort and doubled the output. She found, in the overgrown space behind the communal storehouse, the remnants of what had once been a proper herb garden, and spent an afternoon clearing and turning the soil so that when spring came, something could be planted there again. She did not announce any of this. She did not explain it as coming from the king or from any authority. She simply did it the way she did everything, quietly, steadily, without making it into more than it was. On the 7th night, sitting by Etta's fireplace after the old woman had gone to bed, Maisie looked at the small piece of blank linen Adrian had given her and thought about what she had found here and how she would describe it when she returned. She would not tell him that coin fixed things. She would tell him what coin couldn't fix, which was the human architecture of a community, the web of small competencies and mutual knowledge and presence that held a village together when the harvests failed and the winters came. She would tell him about the herb garden and the roof and the fever that broke and the child who had started eating again this morning and asked for a story about wolves. She would tell him that Cinderfield didn't need more coin. It needed people. Specifically, it needed the kind of people who understood that survival was not a single dramatic act, but 1,000 small ones, done without recognition, in the cold, before dawn, because they needed doing. She folded the linen and put it back in her pocket, untied. She was not ready to go back yet. There was still a week left, and still work to do. What she did not know, could not know, sitting by the low fire in the cold house at the edge of the kingdom's poorest village, was that one of Adrian's 2 escorts had ridden back to the castle on the 4th day to deliver a verbal report. Not because anything was wrong, because something the man had observed through the tree line on his watch had seemed, in his own words to the king, worth reporting immediately. Adrian had listened to the report without expression. Then he had dismissed the man, turned back to his maps, and stood very still for a long moment with his hands braced against the desk. The escort had reported many things: the roof repair, the herb gathering at the creek, the night vigil at the sick child's bedside. What had made him ride back early, the man said, was not any of those things individually. It was the moment he had watched Maisie stand at the edge of the village at dusk on the 3rd day, looking out at the dark line of the forest with her gray cloak around her shoulders, and turn back toward the houses with the specific expression of someone who has found something worth staying for. Not performing, not enduring, choosing. Adrian had not sent her to Cinderfield only to learn about the village. He already knew about the village. Maisie returned to Arden on the 14th day, exactly as agreed. The ride back felt different from the ride out. The road was the same wet earth smell, the same pine resin in the cold air, the same stone marker half buried in mud, where the 2 escorts had left her 2 weeks before. But she was not the same woman who had ridden past it, and the difference was not dramatic or visible in any way she could have easily explained. It was more like the difference between carrying something and setting it down, a subtle shift in weight and posture that only the person carrying it would notice. She had left Cinderfield before dawn, in the dark, after saying goodbye to Etta in the particular way of 2 practical women who don't make ceremony out of things. The old woman had pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into her hands without explanation. The same silver ear she had shown Maisie at the creek, dried and tied with a piece of cord. And said only, "Come back in spring. The garden will need tending." Maisie had tucked the bundle inside her cloak, next to the folded piece of blank linen she had never needed to use, and ridden east toward the castle. She thought about Bretta's daughter, who had told her on the final morning, with the absolute seriousness of a 7-year-old delivering important news, that she had decided Maisie should come back and live in the village permanently. She thought about Colin, who had shown her his repaired roof with the quiet pride of a man reclaiming something he had been afraid to lose. She thought about the 3 women who had organized the firewood rotation, and were already, by the 2nd week, running it without her involvement at all, which had been exactly the point. She did not let herself think about what waited at the end of the road. She was not successful in this. The castle received her the way castles receive returning servants, without ceremony. The outer gate guard noted her return in the log. The stable boy took her horse with the efficient disinterest of someone for whom all horses were equal, and the familiar smell of the inner courtyard, iron and cold stone, and the distant smoke of the kitchens, folded around her like something between a comfort and a reminder of her place. Senna was waiting in the kitchen corridor with her arms already open before Maisie had fully rounded the corner. The embrace was brief and fierce, and said everything neither of them would put into words in a corridor where 3 other kitchen staff could hear them. Then Senna held her at arm's length and looked at her face with the particular scrutiny of someone checking for damage. "You look different," Senna said. "I'm cold, and I need a bath." "Not that kind of different." Senna studied her a moment longer. "You look like someone who made a decision." Maisie didn't answer that. She was saved from answering it by Nora's appearance at the kitchen doorway, the head cook's broad face set in the expression that signified she was deeply relieved and intended to express that relief through immediate practical action. "Soup," Nora said, pointing at the kitchen. "Then the king wants you in the study." Maisie looked up. "How long has he been waiting?" "Since this morning," Nora said, in a tone that added, "And I suggest you not make him wait longer without using those words." She ate the soup standing at the kitchen block. thick broth with root vegetables, the best thing she had tasted in 2 weeks, and then washed her face and hands and climbed the corridor toward the king's study without stopping to change out of her travel clothes. She was a kitchen omega, returning from a village assignment. She had nothing to change into that would make her look like anything other than exactly what she was, and she had decided somewhere on the road back that she was done performing versions of smallness she didn't actually feel. She knocked twice. "Come in." The study was the same as she'd left it. Maps on the desk, torches on the walls, the narrow window looking down into the courtyard. Adrian was standing at the desk rather than the window this time, both hands braced on the stone surface, head bent over a document. He looked up when she entered, and something in the quality of his attention sharpened in a way that was subtle and unmistakable at once. He looked at her the way the escort had described her looking at the village on the third evening, like someone who had found something worth staying for. Maisie filed that observation away carefully and stood at the correct distance from the desk. "You're back," he said. 14 days, as agreed. "Sit down." She sat in the wooden chair across from the desk, the one clearly intended for official meetings, with its straight back and no cushion. Adrian remained standing, which meant their eye levels were nearly matched, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. All of it, in the same direct and specific language she had been organizing in her head for the last 3 hours of riding. She told him about the 2 smoking chimneys out of 7, about the accumulated absences, the blacksmith's wife, the herbalist, the young wolves who had left for better prospects, about Brita's daughter and the fever and the creek and what grew there if you knew where to look, about Colin's roof and the firewood rotation and the herb garden cleared behind the storehouse. She told him that the coin had done what coin could do, and that what remained undone was not a problem that coin solved. "Cinderfield needs a healer," she said. "A permanent one, or close enough to permanent to matter. It needs someone trained in basic building repair who can spend a season there before the next winter. It needs the young wolves who left to have a reason to come back, which means work, real work, not charity, available within the Eastern Territory." She paused. "And it needs the herb garden replanted in spring. I said I would come back for it, but that's separate from the official." She stopped herself. Adrian was watching her with that expression again, the reading in small letters focus, and she realized she had just told the Alpha King of Arden that she had made a personal promise to return to a village in his Eastern Territory, as though it were a simple fact she was reporting. "Go on," he said quietly. She looked at him. "That's the report. You said it was separate from the official report. The garden doesn't require royal intervention. It requires someone to show up and plant things." "I know what it requires," Adrian said. "I'm asking you to finish the sentence you started." Maisie held his gaze. He had told her she could look at him in this room, and she was discovering that this instruction, once accepted, was difficult to revoke. There was something in the direct quality of his attention that made evasion feel not dangerous, but simply unnecessary, like wearing armor inside a room with no weapons in it. "I told a 7-year-old child that I would come back," she said. "And I told an old woman her garden would be tended. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture, the way silences did in rooms where something real was being said. Adrian straightened from the desk. He moved to the window, that position she was beginning to recognize as the one he took when he was thinking, and looked out at the courtyard for a moment before he spoke again. "My counselor will have a recommendation on my desk by the end of the week," he said. "A healer can be arranged within the month. The building repair is more complex, but not impossible. The question of work in the Eastern Territory is one I have been considering independently, and your report adds detail I did not have." He turned from the window. "You did exactly what I asked," he said, "and more than I asked, which is what I expected." Something shifted in Maisie's chest. Not the tight knot feeling from the council hall, but something slower and more complicated, like a door opening in a room she had sealed against drafts so long she had forgotten it had a door. "You said you expected it," she said carefully. "You told your escort to watch the road." Adrian's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Yes. You already knew what I would do there." "I had a strong indication." "Based on what?" He looked at her for a long moment. The torchlight moved on the stone walls. From somewhere below came the faint iron clang of the training yard. "Based on 3 years of observation," he said finally. "You have been in this castle since you were 22. I have watched how you move through it, how you speak to people, what you do when no one is watching." Maisie stared at him. "You've been watching me for 3 years. Observing," he said, with a precision that somehow made it more and not less significant. "There is a difference." "What is the difference?" "Watching is passive," he said. "Observing is a choice." The silence returned, different from the last one. Heavier, more honest. Maisie thought about the council hall 3 weeks ago, the moment his gaze had crossed the room and found her, and how she had immediately looked away because she knew the rules. She thought about the way he had repeated her name in silence with his lips barely moving. She thought about Take the Gray Cloak, the one you came with, and the fact that she had never asked how he knew about it. "How long have you known about the cloak?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile again. "Since the day you arrived," he said. 3 years ago, you were standing at the outer gate in the rain with a worn gray cloak and no pack sigil, and you asked the gate guard very politely for any available work. He almost turned you away." "He did turn me away," Maisie said. "Twice." "I know," said Adrian. "I was at the upper window. I told him on the third approach to let you through." Maisie went very still. She had spent 3 years believing she had earned her place in Arden's kitchens by persistence alone, by coming back to that gate a third time despite 2 refusals, by refusing to accept the closed door as final. It had been the story she told herself about her own survival, the proof that she had made something from nothing through her own stubbornness. And the king had been watching from an upper window. "You," she started, and stopped. "You still earned it," Adrian said, with a quiet certainty that cut directly to the center of what she was feeling. "I told him to let you through. What you did with the 3 years after that was entirely your own." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was lower than before. Not softer, but closer to something unguarded, the tone of a man who has decided that a particular kind of honesty is overdue. "Because I sent you to Cinderfield to confirm something I already believed," he said. "And you confirmed it. And I am done with the part where I observe from a distance and say nothing." The room held that honesty between them like a held breath. Maisie sat very still in the straight-backed chair and looked at Adrian. Really looked at him, without the careful positioning of her gaze, without the omega before alpha discipline that she had worn for so long. It had become nearly indistinguishable from instinct. She looked at the scar along his jaw, and the tired line of his shoulders, and the hands that had gone still at his sides, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes when 2 people have finally stopped performing for each other, that this man had been carrying something for a long time, the same way she had. "What did you need to confirm?" she asked. Adrian moved from the window and sat in the chair on his side of the desk. Not the king's seat, the formal high-back chair used for official audiences, but the plain one beside it, which put him at the same level as her with nothing between them but the edge of the stone desk and a stretch of cold air. "That you were the same outside these walls as inside them," he said. "That what I had been observing for 3 years was real and not a performance shaped by the castle environment. Anyone can be good inside a structure that rewards goodness." He paused. "I needed to know who you were when no one with authority was watching. And now you know. Now I know." Maisie looked at the dried herb bundle still tucked inside her cloak, the silver ear Etta had pressed into her hands before dawn. She thought about what it meant that a king, the Alpha King of Arden, whose words shaped the lives of every pack in the territory, had spent 3 years watching a kitchen Omega from upper windows and sending her on covert village assignments instead of simply speaking. "You could have just talked to me," she said. Something crossed his face that was not quite a wince but lived in the same neighborhood. "Yes. 3 years ago. Yes." "You are aware," she said carefully, keeping her voice level, "that you are describing an extraordinarily roundabout approach to a conversation." "I am aware of that," he said, and there was something in his tone that sounded, for the first time, genuinely undefended. Not apologetic exactly, but honest in the way that things are honest when the armor comes off and what's underneath turns out to be simply human. "I am better at observation than at this. This being saying the thing directly," he said, "to the person it concerns." Maisie studied him for a moment. Then, without entirely planning to, she said, "You're the most powerful alpha in this kingdom, and you are telling me you were afraid to have a conversation." "I am telling you," Adrian said, with the deliberate precision she was learning to read as his version of emphasis, "that the things which matter most are the ones most difficult to say without risking something real, and that I have spent considerable time making sure the risk was worth taking before taking it. By sending me to a cold village for 2 weeks, among other methods." "What other methods?" He held her gaze. 14 months ago, I instructed the kitchen staff that the Omega woman assigned to the Eastern Corridor service rotation was to have access to the library annex during off hours, without explanation." Maisie went still. The library annex. She had discovered that access apparently by accident, a door that had previously been locked and one day simply wasn't, which she had assumed was a maintenance oversight, and had never questioned, because she had been too grateful for it to risk drawing attention. She had spent every free evening for over a year in that room, reading every history and territory record and pack chronicle she could find. "That was you," she said. "The knowledge you have about pack territories, Eastern village conditions, historical harvest records, all of which informed the accuracy of the report you just gave me, came from that library," he said. "I did not send an untrained kitchen servant to Cinderfield. I sent someone I had spent over a year equipping without her knowledge for exactly the kind of work she turned out to do naturally. The full shape of it settled over her slowly, the way large things do. Not all at once, but in stages, each piece arriving and connecting to the last until the whole structure was visible. 3 years of observation. The gate on the third approach. The library door left unlocked. The escort watching the road. The blank linen cloth. All of it careful. All of it quiet. All of it moving in one direction without ever announcing where it was going." "Adrian," she said, and his name without the title felt like stepping off a ledge she hadn't known she was standing on. "What exactly are you asking me?" He was quiet for a moment. The torches moved on the stone walls. From far below came the last iron clang of the training yard closing for the evening, and then silence, and the castle settling into the specific stillness of night. "I am asking," he said, "if you would be willing to stop being a kitchen servant." "And be what instead?" "Mine," he said. Simply. Directly. The way he said everything when he finally decided to say it. "My mate. My queen. The woman who stands beside me and tells me what coin cannot fix, and keeps promises to 7-year-old children and plants herb gardens at the edge of the kingdom because she said she would." Maisie looked at him for a long time. She thought about Senna's voice saying, "You look like someone who made a decision in the kitchen corridor an hour ago." She thought about Etta's hand pressing dried herbs into hers before dawn. She thought about the road back from Cinderfield, and the 3 hours she had spent telling herself firmly not to think about what waited at the end of it, and how completely unsuccessful that effort had been. "You tested me," she said. Yes. And I passed. You didn't pass, he said, and something in his voice was very quiet and very certain. There was no passing. There was only seeing you clearly. And what I saw made every other possible choice feel like a smaller life than the one I actually want. She stood up from the chair. He stood when she did. Reflex, she thought. Or perhaps something older than reflex. The instinct of a man in the presence of something he recognizes as important. They were standing on the same side of the desk now, with less than an arm's length between them, and the cold air of the study felt different from this distance, charged with the specific attention of two people who have stopped pretending they are having a different conversation than the one they are actually having. Maisie reached into her cloak and took out the small bundle of dried silver ear that Etta had given her, and placed it on the desk between them. I'm going back to Cinderfield in spring, she said. The garden needs tending, and I gave my word. I know, said Adrian. And I want the healer arranged within the month, as you said. Already being written into the order. And Bretta's daughter, the 7-year-old, she needs a proper teacher. She's sharp. Don't waste that. I'll send word to the Eastern Territory schools. And Colin, the old man with the roof. He needs... Maisie, Adrian said. She stopped. Yes, she said. Is that a yes? She looked at him, at the scar and the braids and the tired, honest eyes of a man who had watched from upper windows for 3 years, because he was better at observation than at saying the thing directly, at the man who had unlocked a library door without explanation, and sent escorts to watch a road not for security, but for confirmation. At the man who had just told her that every other possible choice felt like a smaller life. It's a yes, she said, with conditions. Name them. Cinderfield first. Before any formal ceremony, before any announcement to the council, Cinderfield gets what it needs. Agreed. And you talk to me, she said, directly. No more observation from upper windows. No more unlocked doors without explanation. If something concerns you, you say it. He looked at her for a moment. That will require practice. I'm aware, she said. I'm willing to be patient while you develop the skill. The almost smile at the corner of his mouth became, for the first time, an actual one. Brief and unguarded, and entirely different from every carefully controlled expression she had seen him wear in the council hall and the study and the courtyard. It lasted only a moment before it settled back into something quieter. But it had been real, and she had seen it, and she understood that she was probably one of a very small number of people who ever had. He reached out and took her hand. Not the commanding grip of an alpha establishing claim, but the careful, deliberate hold of someone handling something they intend not to break, and said nothing further, because nothing further was required. What followed was not simple, because the things that matter rarely are. The council received the announcement 3 weeks later, in the same hall where Maisie had stood with a tilted oil flask and looked away from the king's gaze. Lady Corrine of Velmore went rigid with an expression that moved through disbelief, calculation, and grudging recalibration in rapid succession, before settling into the careful neutrality of a political woman who understood when a position was untenable. The Lord of Ashen asked 3 questions about bloodline and pack status, received 3 direct answers from Adrian in the tone that indicated the questions had been heard and would not be entertained further, and fell silent. The Lord of Draven, who was older than the others and had watched more than one king make decisions the court didn't understand, simply nodded once and reached for his wine. Senna cried in the kitchen corridor and then immediately denied having done so. Nora made a feast that took 3 days to prepare and said nothing about any of it, except that the herb bread had turned out particularly well, which everyone understood was the highest compliment available to her. The healer reached Cinderfield before the first frost of the new season. Maisie had written the letter of request herself, specific and detailed, and the woman who answered it, a gray-haired alpha healer from the Northern Territory named Rowena, who had been looking for exactly this kind of posting, arrived with 2 apprentices and a horse loaded with supplies and stayed permanently. Colin's roof held through the winter without incident. The firewood rotation that 3 village women had developed continued, and was refined and eventually adopted by 2 neighboring villages that sent representatives to learn the system. Bretta's daughter, whose name was Petra, was enrolled in the Eastern Territories teaching house in the spring. She arrived with the complete seriousness of a child who has decided she is going to learn everything available, and proceeded to do exactly that. The herb garden behind Cinderfield's storehouse was planted in March, when the ground softened enough to work. Maisie was there for 3 days with her sleeves rolled up and her gray cloak hung on Etta's door hook, and Adrian rode out on the 2nd day without announcement. No escort, no ceremony, no official reason, and spent the afternoon helping her turn soil in the cold without saying much, which was entirely consistent with his character, and which she had by then stopped finding strange. Etta observed this from her doorway, with the expression of someone whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. She said nothing, went inside, and put water on for tea. The formal bonding ceremony took place at midsummer, in the castle's great hall, with every pack lord in the territory present. Maisie wore a deep blue dress that Senna had spent 6 weeks making. Real fabric, not linen, with careful embroidery at the cuffs and hem that incorporated the small silver ear plant from Etta's bundle, pressed and traced by Senna's careful hand into the pattern. She stood in the center of the hall and did not look at the floor or at a neutral point between chin and chest. She looked directly at Adrian, who was already looking at her, and who had been looking at her, she now understood, for a very long time. When the bonding words were spoken, and the ceremony was complete, and the hall erupted in the noise that large gatherings make when something significant has been settled, Adrian leaned close enough that only she could hear and said very quietly, "I should have talked to you 3 years ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm aware," he said, with the precise intonation she had learned to read as his version of a concession freely given. She laughed, quietly, and not for long, but genuinely. The kind of laugh that comes from being known rather than performed for, from standing in a room full of power and politics and feeling, for the first time in a life that had asked a great deal of her, entirely and unambiguously at home. Outside the castle walls, Arden's territory settled into the long warmth of summer. In the east, Cinderfield's herb garden grew. In the teaching house, Petra learned to read. In the great hall, the lords raised their goblets to a queen who had arrived at a gate in the rain with a worn gray cloak, and asked very politely for any available work. Maisie had not passed a test. She had simply been herself, steadily, quietly, without announcement, until the right eyes finally looked up from the upper window and saw her clearly. And that, it turned out, had been enough. It had always been enough.